Between 1961 and 1975, approximately 2,700 American helicopter door gunners were killed in action in Vietnam. This casualty rate was higher than frontline infantry, higher than pilots, higher than any other aviation specialty. They sat in open doorways with no armor, no protection, strapped to the aircraft by a single nylon strap. They fired thousands of rounds from a vibrating platform moving at 120 knots. They aimed at targets they could barely identify. And when the enemy returned fire, they were the first to die. This was not doctrine. This was not planned. This was battlefield improvisation that became institutionalized because there was no alternative. This is the engineering problem they were sent to solve, with their bodies. To understand why this happened, we must go back. October 1944, Burma Campaign. A Sikorsky R-4 helicopter extracted 4 Allied personnel from a position 8,000 feet above sea level, terrain inaccessible to fixed-wing aircraft. The mission took 3 days. The helicopter could carry 1 passenger at a time. Maximum speed, 75 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 8,000 feet. Engine failures were common. But the mission succeeded. This primitive machine demonstrated a fundamental tactical capability: vertical insertion and extraction from positions where conventional aircraft could not operate. The U.S. Army took note. But the technology was not ready, not for another decade. By June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, helicopter technology had marginally improved. The Bell H-13 Sioux, familiar to many from the opening credits of MASH, could now carry wounded personnel from frontline positions to mobile Army surgical hospitals. The Hiller OH-23 Raven performed similar duties. These aircraft evacuated approximately 23,000 casualties during the Korean War. But both models operated under severe constraints. Maximum useful load, approximately 600 pounds. This meant 1 pilot, 1 medic, 1 stretcher-mounted casualty. No armor, no weapons, no tactical flexibility. They were medical evacuation platforms, nothing more. The concept of armed helicopter operations did not yet exist. There was no doctrine, no training, no weapons integration. Crews occasionally fired personal weapons, M1 carbines, Thompson submachine guns, from open cockpits. This was improvisation, not doctrine. And when they took ground fire, which was frequent, the results were predictable. Severed hydraulic lines, punctured fuel tanks, catastrophic mechanical failures. The helicopters were too fragile. The engines were too weak. The airframes could not support additional weight. In December 1961, the first U.S. Army helicopter companies arrived in South Vietnam. They flew the HU-1 Iroquois, later redesignated UH-1, universally known as the Huey. Initial production models were powered by Lycoming turboshaft engines producing 960 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed, 120 knots. Service ceiling, 12,600 feet. Useful load, approximately 3,880 pounds. This was a significant improvement over Korean War-era helicopters. The Huey could transport 8 combat-equipped infantry, or 6 stretcher-mounted casualties, or 4,000 pounds of cargo. The turboshaft engine was more reliable than piston engines. Maintenance intervals were longer. The aircraft could operate in tropical heat and high humidity. But the Huey was designed as a utility transport. It had no integral weapons. The airframe included minimal armor, quarter-inch steel plates beneath the pilot and co-pilot seats, titanium sheets around critical hydraulic and fuel system components. Total armor weight, approximately 300 pounds. This provided protection against small arms fire from certain angles. Against concentrated fire, it was insufficient. The operational environment in Vietnam bore no resemblance to Korea. There were no defined front lines, no static defensive positions, no predictable engagement zones. The Viet Cong operated as irregular forces, blending with civilian populations, utilizing extensive tunnel networks, and employing hit-and-run tactics. The terrain, Dense jungle, rice paddies, mountainous highlands negated many conventional military advantages. Helicopters offered a solution. They could transport rested, fully equipped infantry directly to operational zones. They could extract wounded personnel under fire. They could resupply isolated positions. They could provide aerial reconnaissance. The concept was called airmobile warfare, and it represented a fundamental shift in tactical doctrine. But doctrine and reality diverged immediately. The Viet Cong quickly learned American helicopter tactics. They studied flight paths, identified likely landing zones, and positioned forces accordingly. They acquired Soviet-supplied weaponry, DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine guns, ZU-23 twin-barrel autocannons, RPG-2 and RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades, and thousands of AK-47 and SKS rifles. They understood that helicopters were the logistical backbone of U.S. operations. Disrupt the helicopters, disrupt the entire system. Between 1961 and 1963, U.S. helicopter losses escalated. Not catastrophically, early operations involved limited combat, but enough to reveal vulnerabilities. Crew chiefs began carrying personal weapons, M14 rifles, M1 carbines, even civilian shotguns. When approaching or departing landing zones, they would fire at suspected enemy positions. This was not doctrine. This was survival. By late 1963, some crew chiefs mounted M60 machine guns on improvised pintle mounts or bungee cords suspended from the cabin ceiling. The M60 provided meaningful suppressive fire, but mounting it on a helicopter presented unique challenges. First, the problem of weight and balance. Every additional pound affected aircraft performance. The M60, ammunition, mounting hardware, and gunner combined to add several hundred pounds. Pilots had to recalculate weight and balance equations for every mission, adjusting fuel loads and passenger capacity accordingly. Second, the problem of ammunition supply. A 100-round belt lasted 10 to 12 seconds of sustained fire. Gunners needed thousands of rounds per mission. Standard practice became linking multiple belts together. 2,000 to 3,000 rounds stored in ammunition cans between the gunner's legs. But this created fire hazards, snagging hazards, and further weight issues. Third, the problem of firing from a moving platform. The helicopter was not stable. It vibrated from rotor wash and engine harmonics. It moved in 3 dimensions: forward, laterally, vertically. The gunner had to compensate for relative motion, wind drift, and the ballistic trajectory of the projectile. This was not like firing from a stationary position. This required experience, instinct, and volume of fire. Fourth, the problem of protection, or lack thereof. The gunner was completely exposed. He sat in an open doorway, secured only by a nylon safety harness, the so-called monkey strap. He had no armor. His flak jacket provided marginal protection against shrapnel. His helmet protected against impact, not bullets. If the helicopter took concentrated fire, he was the most vulnerable crew member. And the enemy knew this. By 1964, the role of the crew chief had split. One crew member, still called the crew chief, maintained responsibility for mechanical maintenance. A second crew member, designated the door gunner, assumed exclusive responsibility for defensive weapons. Standard crew configuration became 4: aircraft commander, pilot, crew chief, door gunner. Each transport helicopter now had 2 M60 machine guns, one covering each side. The United States Army Aviation School at Fort Rucker, Alabama, developed formal training programs. Door gunners learned communications procedures, clock position target identification, formation flying protocols, and, most critically, aerial gunnery techniques. The technical challenges of aerial gunnery are not trivial. Consider the ballistic problem. The helicopter is moving forward at 100 knots, approximately 170 feet per second. The projectile leaves the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. But the projectile inherits the helicopter's forward velocity. This means the bullet's trajectory is not perpendicular to the aircraft's flight path. It angles forward. To hit a stationary target directly below the helicopter, the gunner must aim behind the target. The exact offset depends on altitude, airspeed, and projectile time of flight. But targets are rarely stationary, and helicopters rarely fly straight and level during combat approaches. The pilot executes evasive maneuvers, banking, climbing, descending, to avoid ground fire. This changes the helicopter's velocity vector constantly. The gunner must compensate in real time, without instruments, without fire control computers, relying entirely on visual cues and muscle memory. The standard technique was to fire in long bursts, 10 to 15 rounds, while walking the fire across the target area. Tracer rounds were loaded every fifth round. These provided visual feedback, allowing the gunner to observe where rounds were impacting and adjust accordingly. But tracers had limitations. They were slightly lighter than ball ammunition, so their trajectories diverged at longer ranges. They burned out after approximately 900 meters, and they revealed the gunner's position to enemy forces. The psychological burden on door gunners was extreme. Combat missions averaged 4 to 6 hours. Some lasted longer. The gunner spent this entire time exposed, scanning the terrain below, searching for threats. 90% of flight time involved no contact. Just endless vigilance, endless heat, endless vibration. But that remaining 10% was chaos. Landing zones were the critical vulnerability. A helicopter in flight, moving at speed, presented a difficult target. But during approach and departure, when the aircraft slowed, descended, and hovered, it became stationary. Every weapon within range could engage it. The pilot's priority was getting in and out as quickly as possible. The gunner's priority was suppressing any threat that might prevent this. Standard procedure for a hot landing zone. Gunships, if available, conducted preparatory fires, saturating the area with rockets and machine gun fire. Then transport helicopters approached in trail formation, low and fast. Door gunners opened fire 200 to 300 meters from the landing zone, maintaining continuous fire throughout the approach. The helicopter touched down, sometimes without fully landing, hovering inches above the ground. Infantry dismounted, and the aircraft departed immediately. Total time on the ground, 10 to 15 seconds. During this window, the door gunners never stopped firing. Specialist 4 Gary George Wetzel provides a documented example. On January 8, 1968, Wetzel was serving as door gunner on a UH-1D during a combat assault near Ap Dong An, South Vietnam. His aircraft was struck by an RPG-2 rocket. The explosion severed his left arm below the elbow and caused severe fragmentation wounds across his body. The helicopter crashed. Despite his injuries, Wetzel returned to his M60 machine gun and engaged enemy forces advancing on the downed aircraft. He maintained fire until losing consciousness from blood loss. He regained consciousness, assisted other wounded crew members to covered positions, then lost consciousness again. He survived. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. This was not an isolated case. The weapons evolved. By 1965, some helicopters mounted twin M60 configurations, doubling firepower at the cost of additional weight. The M60D variant, designed specifically for helicopter use, featured spade grips and an improved feed mechanism. That same year, the U.S. Army introduced the M134 minigun, an electrically powered 6-barrel Gatling gun chambered in 7.62 by 51 mm NATO. Rate of fire, 2,000 to 6,000 rounds per minute. Selectable. The weapon was devastatingly effective at suppression. A 2-second burst placed hundreds of rounds on target. But it required external power, consumed ammunition at unsustainable rates, and weighed significantly more than the M60. It was used primarily on dedicated gunships, not transport helicopters. Attempts were also made to mount the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun on helicopters. The round could penetrate light armor and concrete. But the weapon weighed 84 pounds unloaded, and recoil forces were excessive for handheld operation. The M2 never became standard for door gunners. The improvised gunship concept emerged from necessity. By mid-1965, transport Hueys were being retrofitted with forward-firing weapons, fixed M60 machine guns, rocket pods carrying 2.75-inch folding-fin aerial rockets, and 40mm grenade launchers. These gunship Hueys escorted transport helicopters, providing suppressive fire during insertions and extractions. But the UH-1 was fundamentally a transport airframe. Adding weapons reduced cargo capacity, decreased speed, and shortened range. It was a compromise. The solution arrived in September 1967, the Bell AH-1G Cobra. This was not a modified transport helicopter. This was a purpose-designed attack helicopter, the first of its kind. The fuselage was narrow, 36 inches at its widest point, minimizing frontal area. The crew sat in tandem. The gunner occupied the front seat, operating a chin-mounted turret housing a minigun and a 40mm grenade launcher. Stub wings carried rocket pods and, in later variants, anti-tank missiles. The Cobra's engine produced 1,400 shaft horsepower, giving it a maximum speed of 170 knots, 50 knots faster than the UH-1. The airframe incorporated armor protection around the crew compartment and critical systems. It could absorb battle damage that would down a transport helicopter. And it was purpose-built for exactly one mission: killing. The Cobra allowed transport helicopters to return to their original role. Door gunners remained, but their mission shifted. They no longer needed to provide offensive fire. The Cobras handled that. They focused on defensive fire, protecting the aircraft during vulnerable moments. But Dr. Gunners did not disappear. They remained essential for medical evacuations, reconnaissance insertions, and missions where gunship support was unavailable. And they continued to die.